Hello, I'm delighted today to be joined by Osita Madu. Osi, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Right, let's get straight into this. Can you provide us with a brief background into yourself and what you're up to now?
Yeah, certainly. So I work as Senior Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at HS2. Primary responsibility is looking after procurement, supply chain, and also contract management across the sort of diversity and inclusion space. So that includes building all the requirements and having the challenge of really bringing our contractors on board around what their requirements are and how they need to deliver that. And some of those challenges are new to the sector, because in terms of diverse supplier, it's quite rare in the UK to have many companies who win contracts with public sector organizations like ourselves and have to deliver that. And that's not just around compliance, it's actually around the practical outcomes of what they're going to deliver.
Okay. So like you said, abbreviation EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. Where does this passion for EDI come from?
Oh, my passion is probably shaped in the early stages of my HR career. So I started in human resource management going back to about 13 years ago. And that started out generalist, but then went into more specialist recruitment and training and employee relations. And around about 2009, we started to see the sort of early emergence of the Equality Act 2010 as the new sort of single base for equalities legislation. So I started to sort of take on more projects at the organization I was working at the time. And I could clearly see that this can shape the way organizations, both in the public sector and the private sector, are going to work and have a more inclusive approach. So he also sort of highlighted to me the things I've seen throughout my career, that organizations either structurally, through the way they operate, put barriers in place, or the way they make decisions, which often impact on the sort of underrepresented people coming into the organization. And it's something which I became really passionate about and thought, okay, this is a focus and this is something I think will grow in importance over the coming years.
Interesting, and you're clearly correct that there's a few things that highlighted, particularly within the construction industry at the moment: skill shortage, the role in Brexit and things like that, and one of those is certainly equality, diversity and inclusion right across that supply chain. I'm just interested to get your thoughts on if there's like a wider strategy organizations can potentially use to bring diversity into their own businesses.
Yes, certainly. I think really starts with being honest and realistic about what you can achieve. So if you're going to have a strategy, make sure that it's fit for purpose. Because I think sometimes some organizations start to be too over-ambitious and want to change the world, which is impossible. So focus on 1, 2, or 3 things that you can do really well over a number of years. And that number of years could be 2 or 3 years, but no longer than that. Because that gives you a realistic timescale, but also gives you a more specific focus on what you should actually deal with. And also the strategy should be one that there is a whole consultation across the organizations and your stakeholders, so they understand what you're trying to achieve. So there's no point doing that in silo. HR can't deliver it alone, nor the corporate center. It needs the buy-in across both your sort of senior exec level, your board, your customer base, external and internal customer base, so they understand what you are actually trying to achieve. And be very clear who can help you. Often the things around EDI strategy, equality, diversity and inclusion, is that you can't do it alone by saying you get an EDI specialist in place. That specialist needs to be in a position to know, how do I engage with the stakeholders? How do I get the buy-in, and who can do what as part of delivering that strategy? And also that has to be tallied along with the business objectives and the visions and the values of the organization. Because that's important, because without that, you're really missing the key link of the cultural change, because that's what it's really aimed to do. So having a strategy you've got to be thinking about what is it about the culture of our organization we also want to change. And an example of that through HS2 is that we have values moment, which is something that's tied into our HS2 values. So every time we start a meeting, somebody will bring up something around the values, something they've observed, experienced, or seen more recently. And within that, there is a respect values, which covers equality, diversity, and inclusion. And so when we start to formulate our strategy, we have that in mind, that we need to respect as part of our values, and we build all the structures around that respect agenda. So it requires various inputs, but I think those are the sort of building blocks.
Fantastic. I love the fact that it's company led. You know, it's not an individual, it's not a team, it's not just a group, it's company led. And I think that's where you get the right level of buy-in. And if you do that right from the very start as well, it's no good setting all these things and then saying, oh, everybody buy into this thing we've created. It has to be, and that adds on to the culture change as well. It has to be that collective approach, doesn't it?
Yes, entirely right.
Yeah. So I just want to go into a little bit more detail about one specific element around this, which is quite a big thing about recruitment, really. And how can you make sure, or organizations out there make sure, that they're recruiting a more diverse employment base?
It's a good question. I think you've got to be honest about what the barriers are in terms of your recruitment process. So looking historically at how you recruit and scrutinizing that is important. And you perhaps need to get an external consultant to come in to do that, a recruitment specialist or an EDI specialist to look at that. And sometimes we are not conscious of the things we do through recruitment, how we select candidates, how we have preferential treatments of certain candidates, how the actual tools we use for recruitment and selection remove certain people from that process. So, for example, we know that disproportionately people with disabilities suffer much more through the recruitment process, either because adjustments is not made up front to allow them to attend interviews and selection, or to have the platform that will allow them to interact with the organization. But further than that, at the point when you actually offer somebody a role, you also need to make sure there is further adjustments when they start with you. And that could include things around assistive technology, their workstations, how they communicate, etc. And so being aware of those things up front and making adjustments to the way you recruit is very, very key. So one of the things we've done at HS2, and it's worked really well, is use blind auditioning. So blind auditioning allows you to, in essence, remove all those sort of indicators that may allow subjective judgments to be made. So names, whether somebody has gender, particularly the ethnicity, anything at all that would give an indication of their background. And so what it forces you to do is to focus on the measures you need for the role. What are the competencies you need for the role? What are the knowledge, skills, and experience? And how will that be measured? Also being aware that things like years of experience is a barrier in itself. And sometimes when somebody has 10 years or more experience, it doesn't make them more competent in the role. It just means they've been in the role much longer. So you've got to make sure you're measuring the right things as well. So once you've built those things up front through your job descriptions and through the actual recruitment agencies or platforms you use, and make sure you farm it out as wide as possible. We often hear about companies only using select few who are on their preferred supplier list for recruitment, but they've never scrutinized those agencies they've used, for example, or that they go through one only platform, which is LinkedIn, or don't look at other sort of diverse recruitment organizations that might give them a wider pool of people. And so being honest and going through that and really doing some groundwork to uncover what the barriers are. And then being in a position to actually train your hiring managers is key. So whoever's going to do the hiring, you need to ensure that they're aware of their biases. There is a more diverse panel, who is actually going to interview. So it's not an all-male panel. It's not a particular sort of group, which is you want to avoid groupthink as part of that. And so there is a lot of upfront work you need to do before you actually then start to roll out that recruitment that should be more inclusive. But we know traditional way of recruiting has created barriers. And the more you're able to remove that, the better.
Okay, interesting. So the next step, I suppose, is if you do have this, or you manage to get this diverse employment base in place, what are the benefits that this brings?
It's a good question, because often people think, what's the difference? We're functioning as an organization. We're doing really well. We're hitting our targets. We're performing. We're very competitive. What's the need for diversity? Well, actually, companies change and the environment we operate changes. And so you have to be accountable in terms of understanding that the very people you bring through the door, the more diverse they are, the more it's going to change the way you operate, the way you think, and the way you make decisions. And so that diversity of thought is really the key point about it. If you have the same type of people who are coming through the door, making the same type of decisions, you're unlikely to get the sort of changes you want, and you're likely to be more competitive in the market. So I think the first thing is the diversity of thought, which is key. The second thing is that if you have a customer base that you're trying to reach, and there's been challenges in reaching that customer base, then actually having an understanding around diversity, what your diverse customers want, how they've changed over time, and having the sort of staff that can reach out to those customer base is key and important. And also, I think the third angle, particularly relevant to my area around procurement and contract management, we often see that where there is a barrier is business to business. So minority-owned businesses, whether they be women-owned, whether they're disabled-owned, often don't get to win contracts with big companies. So they removed from the whole selection process in terms of tendering. And so if you're in a position to actually bring them on board, you start to see the difference in terms of delivery, in terms of the type of businesses that they're bringing on board, and in terms of innovation. And we're seeing that small, medium, minority-owned businesses are quite innovative, but they're not given the opportunity to bid for contracts and demonstrate that. So it's really changing that sort of level at those three stages and ensuring that you're fit for purpose for the future. And organizations that are not diverse won't continue to survive in a very dynamic and progressive environment that we're in.
Yeah, that's a nice way to summarize that. It's a requirement, a necessity, sorry, should I say, rather than a nice to have. It can just do wonders for an organization. Okay, slight shift change before we start to wrap up. Can you tell us more about the supply chain verification service?
Yeah, so that's we've got a supply chain that we developed from the ground up. 2016, we were more or less given a clean sheet to say, look, what do we want the supply chain to look like? And so the verification standard is one of the measures we use. It's almost like an audit purpose. So if you say to us at HS2, we do wonderful things on diversity, we've got great policy, we've had no issues around discrimination or tribunal cases. We're doing really well in terms of representation of women across the organization and even at senior level. We've got robust training that we evaluate and we're measuring the impact it has on staff. So you're saying all these great things that you do as an organization. One of the ways to prove that and evidence that is through an EDI verification standard. So an equality, diversity and inclusion verification standard is a standard that is carried out and assessed by an external body. So there are a number of external standards out in the market. So there's National Equality Standard that's owned by EY, and EY has made that robust to such an extent that you can look at different components within your organizations. And then you've got things like, for example, the Clear Assured standard, which is owned by the Clear company. And that in itself looks at continuous improvement and areas where you are doing well across diversity, across your organization. And then you start to look at things, for example, the equality standard mark as well. So there's a number of standards you can choose, but ultimately you want to be able to see, how good am I? And is it evidence that we're actually as good as we say we are? And the only way to do that is to get an external body to undertake that assessment. Most of that verification standard will last for, say, 2 to 3 years, at which point then you need to be looked at again to see whether you retain that standard or you've made improvements.
I think it's so easy to to just kind of not pay lip service to these things, but just to say, yes, we do these things. Of course we want equality, of course we want diversity, but without putting those markers in place, without having that verification of what you're doing, it can be quite easy to not step up and do the right thing across the board. So that's really cool to hear that. I like that. That's great. Just final question as we start to wrap up. What does the future hold for you? What's next, and what are you seeing in the future?
It's an interesting question. I think the future for me is one where the diverse supply chain becomes more prominent within the UK diversity market. It's well developed in the US because you see big pharmaceutical companies having diverse supply chain, and they need to demonstrate how they're actually attracting and working with minority-owned businesses to win contracts. Because some companies operate on a model where a large proportion of what they do, 60%, is all subcontracted out. And so if you're not looking at diversity from that angle, then you're missing the opportunity to bring on board minority-owned businesses who can do some great work with yourselves. So I think the future in the UK has to focus more on that. There is already a well-developed case for the HR sort of workforce dimension around diversity. You know, how do you attract more diverse talent? How do you sort of recruit them, and how do you retain them? That is a very well-developed sort of piece across the UK. The other angle I think that's perhaps needs to be focused more is around disability. I think is a more of a weaker link when you look at the protected characteristics. We often talk about women being underrepresented and the challenges of women in the workplace. And that's been well known, and we continue to do that. We also talk about race and ethnicity, but disability is one area that I think is not as well developed. And there's a huge work around disability. And when you look at things, for example, WC3, which is the World Wide Web, and they look at things around assessment. So for example, if you've got a website, it's assessed to make sure that it's AA standard, which is a good standard around disability access for those to use the website, or AAA standard. And so I think there are things that companies can be doing to assure themselves in an age that we're working in, that all their tools they use, both web, both apps, etc., are totally accessible to those with disability, whether they want to apply, whether they want to interact or obtain information. And I don't think we're at the stage where that's become the norm. It's still an evolving area. And there are many people who, throughout the career, develop disabilities. It's not something that starts off at a certain point in life, but there could be, you know, work-related disability, and it doesn't change their skill set. They're still skilled, as experienced as they are. It's just changing the way you work. And that will become more important as we become more autonomous and there's AI in place. We really need to welcome and look at disability, because I think it's an area that will grow. And finally, I think one of the things around equality, diversity, and inclusion is making sure people understand what the end game is. I think there is a lot of language around compliance. You know, this is a legal requirement, we just do it and tick the box, we've arrived, and that's never enough. So actually seeing it as business critical. In other words, if you're not part of this journey and making sure your organization operated on this basis, you're not going to be around and relevant in the years to come. And we're starting to see that in the way graduates and young people are making the decisions about the type of companies they want to join. The more companies that are more diverse and have a profile and have a right ethics and drive change are the sort of companies that actually want to join. It's more exciting, it reflects who they are. And I think those are the sort of decisions companies need to have at the forefront of their mind as well.
Fantastic. Osita, thank you so much for your time today. We connected because you're on Kudos In Construction, the list that Barbara ABI created over a number of months for diversity and the work that you're doing there. And you can just tell the way you speak, you're eloquent, you're passionate about it. And, you know, I'm just excited for you and the future in terms of what you bring to that area of construction, HS2 and whoever you work with in the future. So thank you so much for joining us today and all the good work you do. Thank you for your time, Peter, and it's a pleasure to be interviewed by you.